Hey guys, it's Tomby. Welcome back, and today I want to try to do something a little different, and that is to highlight a specific plant in my collection. This is one of my favorite houseplants, not just because it's easy to grow and really beautiful, but also because it has a super interesting history and growing subculture around it. And that plant is this tiny thing here, and I actually have two of them. These are both neofinetia falcata, which are commonly known as wind orchids. I did originally do a really brief overview on these in another video of mine, but I have fallen down a rabbit hole of research and I just wanted to share that with you guys because I think it's super cool. But these plants are really popular all across East Asia and specifically in Korea and Japan. And now they're starting to become a lot more popular across the world in Europe, in the US, and all sorts of other places. And why are these plants so popular? Well, there's a lot of reasons. This is an orchid, so like many of the orchids that you usually see, these will regularly bloom, usually once a year, but sometimes you'll find kinds that bloom more than once a year. And these flowers are not only beautiful, but they also have a really nice fragrance that some people describe as being really similar to jasmine. And then another thing is the size. It's very small and that makes it easy to grow inside your house, and it just makes it feel like even more precious. But as you probably noticed, these two are not exactly the same, and that's because there are over 2,000 documented varieties of this species of orchid. There are different leaf shapes, leaf colors, and all sorts of other things, and for that reason, a lot of people have started collecting them because they're interested in all these characteristics. So where did these orchids come from? Well, the neofinetia falcata actually has a pretty wide distribution across East Asia. It's native to Japan, Korea, and southeastern China. And it's actually been grown as a houseplant for hundreds of years now. So it was earliest documented as being cultivated during Japan's Edo period, and that's part of the reason why it's also gained the common name the samurai orchid, which is because they were supposedly loved by the shogun Tokugawa Ienari, and because of the ruling class's fascination with this kind of orchid, it also gained the name fukiran. This means the orchid of the rich and noble, and this orchid sort of maintained a pretty steady following of people who were interested in growing it. In the early 1900s, these were very expensive and could really only be purchased or collected by people in the upper class. But nowadays, the cost has gone down significantly due to the growth of the hobby. There are more people breeding, growing, and selling them online. So ultimately, this is a much more accessible hobby now. However, there are still some varieties of this orchid that can go for several thousands of dollars per plant, not unlike the rare houseplants that you see pretty often in the US, like variegated monsteras and other kinds of plants in that manner. So I guess unlike the rare houseplants that we typically see in the US here, which are about variegated foliage, there's a bunch of different other characteristics about this plant that can be variegated, and I'm just going to read them off here. There's root color, leaf shape, leaf variation in color, flower colors, flower shapes, and there are even some much more specific ones that I'm not going to cover in this video because they're really minute. The stem color, the leaf joint shape, leaf curvature, blooming habits, and flower directionality. So when you think of plant roots, what color do you usually think of? I either think of the color white for regular houseplants or green for the orchids that I have. And what's crazy about the neofinetia is that there are a bunch of different colors that can appear on the roots. Even on my neofinetia here, which I mentioned before in an older video that this one actually has bright pink root tips. In that video, they weren't yet visible, but now those roots have grown out and they're super visible. You can see here that there are some pretty light root tips, and then there's another root that is just starting to come out at the base of the stem here, and it's a really bright magenta. And some of the other colors include green, white, a mixture of like red, brown, even yellow, and other shades of pink, and I've never seen roots like that before. I will say that if you go and buy one of these plants and you're hoping for it to have a specific root color, or you buy it for a specific root color, it's not actually always going to be those colors. Those colors are only when the roots are in active growth. When I first bought that orchid, it actually didn't have any pink roots because it wasn't currently growing. But now that I've had it in my care, under some lights, and in my warm room, it started growing and now has those pink roots. So another really interesting variable about these plants is the leaf shape. There are some that have these really curvy, wavy leaves. There are some that have very pointy straight leaves. You have ones that have a really even curve all the way throughout the leaf. There's also specific words for all of these leaf shapes in Japanese. And then probably one of the most popular characteristics about these plants is the leaf variegation. The leaves can exhibit all sorts of different kind of variegation, from marginal variegation like some spider plants that you might be used to seeing, even some pink on the leaves, very dark leaves, and mottled leaves with multiple colors. There are just all sorts of different kinds of leaves that this orchid has, and it's pretty crazy. Of course, the garbage truck is here on the only sunny day of the week, and it's very loud. Finally, let's talk about the flower colors and flower shapes. So there's a ton of different colors that this flower can appear in. The most basic color of flower is just pure white. And then in order of commonness, I guess I would say it would probably be pink/magenta, then green, then yellow, or maybe green and yellow are equally uncommon. But those are some of the main colors that this orchid can flower in. But there are hybrids with other species that you can get that will ultimately have more variety in the colors if that's what you're looking for. There is the most basic flower form, which is this one. But the flower is actually a whole nother topic in itself because all of the individual parts of the flower can be different sizes, different shapes, or they can mutate to create flowers that look like this, or flowers that look like little stars. This variant has flowers that never open and creates a really interesting shape. And then this variant has flowers that have 3 spurs instead of 1, and that creates a really interesting firework-like display of flowers. Now let's talk about how to grow these orchids. I genuinely think that these orchids are very, very easy to grow because there are so many different ways that you can grow them. Some people will grow them in bark, like typical orchids. Some people will mount them to wood to simulate what it's like when they're growing in their natural environment. And I've even seen some people mount them to terracotta pots. But the most traditional method of growing these orchids is by using full sphagnum moss. And this is typically done using a mound of sphagnum similar to the ones that I have mine planted in. So probably the biggest difference about growing these orchids versus regular orchids is that they like to have a quicker wet-dry cycle. And that means they're usually completely dry 4 to 5 days after I water them. When you're using full sphagnum moss, that can be kind of hard to accomplish. So there are a couple different ways that people do this. One of the ways that's relatively common is by using these plastic net pots. And these net pots have a lot more extra holes so that there's more airflow, and that way the moss can dry out faster. And I even cut a hole in the bottom so that I can feel how wet the moss is from underneath. Because oftentimes when the moss is completely dry on the top of the plant, the inside is still a little bit wet. And you want to make sure that when you water your plant, the entirety of the moss is completely dry. So the hole really helps with that. The more traditional method, and the method that I think personally looks better, is by planting the moss mound in a unglazed terracotta pot. And this is a pot I actually made myself because they can be kind of hard to find in the US. So because this is unglazed terracotta, not only does the water evaporate from the top of the moss, but it also gets absorbed into the body of the pot. There's also a hole that I left on the bottom of this pot so I can still check with my finger to make sure that the inside of the moss mound is dry. To water these plants, I usually just soak the entire pot in a larger pot of water, and that way I can make sure that the entire moss ball is saturated. When it comes to fertilizing these plants, I use the MSU Orchid Fertilizer by Tizula, and I usually mix it to about 1/2 to 1/4 strength, and I just water them with it pretty much every time that I water them because I usually can't remember when the last time that I fertilized them. And then in terms of light requirements, I would say that these are actually medium to low light plants. I use a sheer curtain over my south facing window, and I also have an additional like frosted acrylic like folder sleeve that I put in front of them to diffuse the light even more, and they seem to be doing really well with that. And I think that's pretty much it in terms of care, but where can you buy these? So probably one of the easiest and fastest ways that you can get your hands on a neofinetia falcata is by using eBay or Etsy. And then there are a couple smaller scale nurseries. So for example, there's Orchid Web, New World Orchids, and Seed Enge. Both of my plants were purchased from Seed Enge, and I am very, very satisfied with the quality of the plants. And if any of these smaller sellers don't have exactly what you're looking for, you can actually buy neofinetia from international nurseries. However, the shipping cost is going to be a little bit higher as well. So a couple of these nurseries that I know about are Barampung, which is a Korean nursery, and Negie Orchids, which is a Japanese supplier. In the case that you do want to order from these companies and you don't want to pay that full shipping fee, you can often find places that are willing to place a group order from these nurseries. The best place that I have found for that is actually on Facebook, and I'll drop a link to that Facebook group in the description below. I think this is a really special subculture of gardening, and these are ultimately very special and very interesting plants. I hope in the future I can make a video about this topic that is a lot more in-depth. I would love for more people to get interested in it. I also think that there are a ton of plants that are really popular in Asia that are worth talking about and learning about, like Cymbidium goringii, the Rhodea japonica, and the Dendrobium maniliforme. And I actually am planning on making a video about the Dendrobium as well, but that is ultimately for another time. So the last thing that I want to say about the neofinetia is actually a quote from Negie Orchids, and it says, "It was once said that fukiran is only a samurai's hobby, but now it is a hobby for everyone. I really hope the old and new characters of fukiran will bring us more newcomers and create the greatest fukiran boom we ever had." So that's all that I have for you guys this time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it informative. And if you did, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe, because I'll have a lot more content like this in addition to all sorts of other types of content, like my pottery content and pottery content that involves both pottery and my passion for gardening. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!